Imagine this. You're sitting in a room with a bunch of people, and suddenly they start dividing up a whole continent like it's a pizza. Sounds crazy, right? Well, that's exactly what happened at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. European nations came together and decided who would take which parts of Africa without asking a single African. But here's the strange part. One major European power was completely missing from the table: Russia. Unlike Britain, France, and other colonial giants, Russia never took part in carving up Africa. But why? Was it because they couldn't? Or was there a bigger plan all along? Understanding Russia's absence from Africa's colonization isn't just a history lesson. It might help explain a lot of what's happening in the world today. So let's break it down. It's easy to think Russia simply wasn't interested in Africa, but that's not the case. They actually wanted to establish trading posts and spread their influence, just like other European nations. They even had religious missions aimed at introducing Orthodox Christianity to African regions. But despite all this interest, Russia never really committed to colonization. Why? Because several major roadblocks made it nearly impossible for them to succeed. Russia's location was a massive disadvantage. Unlike Britain or France, which had easy access to Africa through the Atlantic Ocean, Russia was way too far. The country was landlocked in the north, with its main ports frozen for much of the year. The only way to reach Africa would have been through incredibly difficult and expensive routes. While European ships could set sail from Lisbon, London, or Paris straight to Africa, Russia would have had to navigate thousands of extra miles, facing harsh weather conditions and unreliable supply lines. Simply put, getting to Africa and staying there would have been a logistical nightmare. To even attempt a trip to Africa, Russian ships would have had to take a long detour through the Black Sea, but there was just one problem. The Ottoman Empire controlled that route. And if you know anything about history, you know Russia and the Ottomans weren't exactly best friends. For centuries, they were bitter rivals, constantly clashing over territory and power. One of their biggest conflicts, the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, left both sides with deep hostility. So expecting the Ottomans to just let Russia pass freely, yeah, that wasn't going to happen. But let's say somehow they did manage to squeeze through. That still wouldn't have been the end of their troubles. Even if Russia found a way past the Ottomans, they'd still have to deal with the British. And guess who controlled the Suez Canal? The fastest and most important route to Africa. Yep, the British Empire. At that time, Britain was the ultimate global superpower, and they weren't about to let a Russian fleet casually sail through their territory without a challenge. Any attempt to reach Africa through the canal would have likely been met with military resistance or political roadblocks. Alright, so if Russia couldn't go through the Black Sea and the Suez Canal, what about another way? The only other option was a massively complicated route. Leave St. Petersburg, Russia's main port in the north. Sail across the Baltic Sea. Pass through the North Sea. Enter the Atlantic Ocean. Finally make the long journey south to Africa. Sounds doable, right? Not exactly. First, that route meant navigating through Danish-controlled waters, which would have been tricky. Then, Russia would have had to deal with more rival nations along the way, including the British and the French. The sheer distance, hostile territories, and logistical challenges made this entire trip nearly impossible. While other European powers were racing to grab African land, Russia decided to look closer to home. Instead of struggling to claim distant territories, they expanded eastward, into Siberia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. These areas were massive, rich in resources, and most importantly, within reach. But geography wasn't the only thing holding Russia back. It had another huge problem to deal with. Before a country could think about expanding overseas, it had to have its own house in order. And for Russia, that was far from the case. Throughout the 19th century, the Russian Empire was like a giant ship struggling to stay afloat. Instead of focusing on claiming new lands in Africa, its leaders were busy dealing with internal crises, angry citizens, and economic struggles that made overseas colonization almost impossible. Imagine a country so massive that keeping it together felt like an impossible task. Russia stretched across Europe and Asia, but within its borders, tensions were brewing. People were frustrated. Some wanted more rights, some wanted better living conditions, and others wanted to overthrow the government entirely. One of the first signs of trouble came in 1825 with the Decembrist Revolt, a failed uprising by military officers who didn't like how Russia was being ruled. They tried to change things, but the government crushed them. However, their ideas of reform didn't disappear. In fact, they only grew stronger over time, leading to more unrest. Then came more wars, more protests, and more chaos. The Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, drained Russia's economy and left it weak compared to other European powers. Instead of focusing on global expansion, the government had to scramble just to keep its own empire stable. Even if Russia had wanted to colonize Africa, there was one big problem: money. Unlike Britain or France, which had booming industries and advanced economies, Russia was stuck in the past. For centuries, Russia had relied on a system where peasants, called serfs, were basically tied to the land and worked for wealthy landowners. This system was outdated and made economic growth painfully slow. When serfdom was finally abolished in 1861, it was meant to be a step forward, but instead it created more problems than solutions. Former serfs struggled to find stable work, landowners lost their source of free labour, and the country had to figure out how to modernise overnight. It was a financial disaster that left little room for expensive overseas ventures. To make things worse, Russia's industrial progress was way behind Western Europe. While Britain and Germany were building massive factories, advanced railways and powerful navies, Russia's infrastructure was weak. The roads were bad, the train system was underdeveloped, and the technology was outdated. How could Russia possibly maintain colonies overseas when it could barely keep up at home? Russia wasn't just struggling with politics and economics, it was also dealing with deep social divisions. The empire was made up of dozens of different ethnic groups, each with its own language, culture, and grievances. Keeping all these groups under control took enormous effort and resources. The abolition of serfdom didn't magically solve the problems of the lower classes. Instead, peasants who expected freedom and prosperity were left frustrated and angry. Rebellions and small uprisings broke out across the empire. Then came revolutionary groups. Some wanted democracy, some wanted socialism, and others wanted to tear down the entire system. Groups like the Narodniks and the Social Democrats began pushing for radical change, making the government even more paranoid about controlling its own people, rather than chasing after foreign lands. With a nation constantly on edge, how could Russia afford to think about colonizing Africa? And that was just the beginning of Russia's struggles. But there was another huge reason why they never got involved in Africa. Sometimes the simplest answer is the most overlooked. While European powers were scrambling to divide Africa, Russia barely paid attention. But why? It wasn't because Russia didn't know about Africa, or didn't have the means to explore it. Unlike Britain or France, which were relatively small and relied on colonies for resources, Russia was gigantic. It stretched across 2 continents and had access to vast amounts of land, forests, minerals, and even fur-rich territories in Siberia and North America, before selling Alaska to the US in 1867. Russia didn't need African goods or markets the way other European nations did. It was already busy extracting resources from its own lands, which provided more than enough wealth to sustain its empire. Russia's priorities were right next door. Instead of expanding into far-off places like Africa, the empire was more concerned with maintaining power in Europe and Asia. They had rivals to deal with, like the Ottoman Empire, and internal conflicts that kept them occupied. Pushing into Africa would have been a massive stretch of resources, with little payoff compared to what they already had at home. While Britain and France had a long history of expansion and saw colonization as part of their national identity, Russia didn't share the same enthusiasm for overseas empire building. Instead of sailing across oceans, Russia preferred to expand its borders the old-fashioned way, by taking land that was directly connected to its territory. It focused on Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Far East rather than trying to control lands thousands of miles away. But even if Russia had wanted to colonize Africa, there was another huge problem. In the 19th century, having a strong navy was non-negotiable for any country hoping to build overseas colonies. If you couldn't control the seas, you couldn't protect your territories. Britain had the world's most powerful navy. France had a strong fleet, and even smaller European nations had invested heavily in naval power. Russia, not so much. Russia's fleet was outdated, poorly equipped, and lacked the reach needed to establish and defend colonies in distant places like Africa. Their ships were mainly built for European conflicts, not long-distance expeditions. If Russia had attempted to establish a presence in Africa, it would have had no way to defend its colonies against naval attacks from stronger European powers. Britain and France dominated the oceans, meaning Russia would have been at their mercy. Not everyone in Russia supported the idea of chasing colonies. Many believed that instead of wasting money on faraway lands, the government should focus on fixing problems at home. Russia was already struggling with economic instability, internal revolts, and an outdated infrastructure. With so much to deal with inside its own borders, why spend money and resources trying to control distant lands? Most people assume Russia never even tried to colonize Africa, but that's not entirely true. In fact, there was a moment in history when Russia took a shot at establishing a foothold on the continent. In 1897, Russia sent a delegation to Ethiopia, hoping to form stronger ties and possibly bring the country into its sphere of influence. Leading this mission was Lieutenant Grigory Chertkov, a Russian officer who, like many Europeans at the time, believed in the supposed superiority of his race. As Russian troops marched inland from the port of Djibouti to the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa, they didn't exactly blend in. Dressed in colonial-style uniforms and white pith helmets, a symbol commonly associated with European imperialists, they looked no different from the French, British or Italian colonizers. The Russians hoped to forge an alliance, but Ethiopia, already a fiercely independent nation, wasn't looking for a new foreign power to control it. Russia's African ambitions didn't end there, though. A decade earlier, in 1885, a Russian adventurer named Nikolai Ashinov had an even crazier idea. He dreamed of building a Russian colony in Africa. Not just a small outpost, but an empire stretching across Sudan, Ethiopia, and the Red Sea coast. Ashinov believed he could gather enough volunteers to establish a strong Russian settlement, and he wasn't shy about pitching the idea to powerful figures in St. Petersburg. At first, Russian leaders were intrigued. Unlike other European powers, Russia didn't have a strong presence in Africa, and some officials thought this could be a cheap and easy way to change that. Rather than sending an army, some Russian ministers suggested a different strategy, privately funding the expedition. This way, they could avoid military risks and expenses while still claiming land. Even high-ranking officials, like Konstantin Pobedonostsev, a major advisor to the Russian emperor, saw potential in the plan. Navy Minister Ivan Shestakov also believed establishing a coal station on the Red Sea coast could benefit Russia's growing navy, especially after the Suez Canal opened in 1869. It seemed like the pieces were falling into place, but then it all fell apart. At a time when European empires were scrambling to claim every piece of Africa they could get their hands on, a few ambitious Russians had their own ideas. Unlike Britain or France, Russia wasn't in the game of overseas colonization. One of them was Nikolai Baranov, the governor of Nizhny Novgorod. He saw Africa as a goldmine of untapped resources and had a bold plan: create a Russian-African company, complete with its own fleet and military force, to take control of trade and extraction. His idea caught the attention of Emperor Alexander III, who, though hesitant, was intrigued by the idea of expanding Russia's influence. Meanwhile, a man named Nikolai Ashinov had even grander ambitions. He wasn't just interested in trading, he wanted to plant the Russian flag on African soil. In March 1888, a Russian warship carrying Ashinov and his men arrived off the coast of what is now Djibouti, while his associate, Lieutenant A.K. Ivanovsky, negotiated with the local leader to secure land. Ashinov got to work building a settlement he proudly named New Moscow. When he returned to Russia, he painted a picture of success, talking about a thriving Russian colony ready for expansion. Plans were made to send settlers, with religious backing from a prominent Orthodox leader, Archimandrite Paisi. But there was just one problem: New Moscow didn't actually exist. Despite Ashinov's grand claims, the truth was far less impressive. His men, facing food shortages and a harsh environment, had abandoned the settlement. There was no thriving colony, just a few desperate settlers trying to survive. Rather than facing humiliation, Russia's government distanced itself from Ashinov's failed experiment. But believing there was still a chance, they allowed a second attempt, this time as a private mission. In December 1888, over 100 settlers set sail from Odessa, determined to establish a Russian foothold in Africa. By January 1889, they had arrived in the Gulf of Tadjoura and took over an abandoned Ottoman fort in Sagallo, where they proudly raised the Russian flag. But there was one major problem: the French had already claimed the land. Despite reassurances from local leaders that Russia could settle there, the French saw the newcomers as trespassers. And they didn't waste time responding. In February 1889, French warships appeared off the coast and opened fire on the settlement. Caught completely off guard, the Russians suffered casualties, and the survivors were rounded up and shipped to Egypt before being sent back to Russia. The whole fiasco was an embarrassment for Russia. The government, wanting to avoid a diplomatic crisis with France, denied any involvement and made no further attempts at African colonization. Russia never pursued colonization in Africa again, but the question remains, what if it had? Would today's geopolitical landscape look different? Would Russia have established a long-term presence on the continent? We want to hear your thoughts. What do you think kept Russia from joining the scramble for Africa? And looking at Russia's modern-day involvement in Africa, how might history have changed if their colonization attempts had actually worked? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.